The wait is finally over. Sorry, I don't know what happened to my voice there. Now before we start, subscribe, like and tell your friends, cat, dog, squirrel or any other animal about A Tribe Called Cars, because all support is greatly appreciated. From now on I'll be aiming to release one video on Wednesday and another on Friday every week. Anyway, the point of this Forza Horizon 4 tuning guide is to give you a basic overview because it's something I get questions about all the time. Fortunately, it's really not that complicated once you've tuned up a few cars. In fact, the more I play, the more I realise that there's this illusion of complexity, a weird combination of real-world physics, weird exceptions, and a placebo effect. Basically, try to avoid stressing about tuning, as your driving technique and knowledge of the roads is almost always going to make up more time than fine-tuning your rear camber. Though it seems stupid to say that the pre-chosen settings usually work okay, given that I've made a long video and written a long article about it, it's actually true. But maximum performance and preferable handling to your driving style are rarely the same thing, so stick around to help get the best out of your cars and make them more drivable. Feel free to also check out my Forza Horizon 4 10 tuning tips article as well for some other useful stuff. Let's start with how you pick your upgrades and their importance. Now I say importance because the lower points index or PI number, basically the thing that governs if your car is B, A, S1, S2 or X class, the more limited your options are. Although it's boring, the all-wheel drive or AWD conversion, as it's also known, is best for racing as it gives you the best off-the-line acceleration and it's easier to control. The simple fact is that rear-wheel drive in this game without traction control can be a nightmare. So if you want to remain competitive, particularly online, it's usually best to go all-wheel drive. Yes, it's boring and yes, it usually costs you points and added weight, but it's overpowered for a reason. Especially online where the skill level can be higher, a rear-wheel drive car will take much greater effort to compete. Next up, I would say, is a combination of reducing weight and increasing power. Because in the motoring world, power to weight ratios matter. I would suggest doing at least one stage of the weight reduction upgrade, because the less weight an engine has to move, the more effective it becomes, and the less strain there is on the tyres. Grip is hugely important in Forza Horizon 4 too, so next I usually go into tyres and rims. The race compound is great if building an X-Class car, but you can usually get away with stock if you need to save points, as the grip difference isn't massive. Front width is okay to leave as it is. In the real world, it would help with cornering as there would be more tyre surface on the road, plus other benefits and some other negatives such as increased rolling resistance. But here it doesn't seem to make much difference, as I found out while making this tuning guide. Rear width, however, does make a difference, so go as wide as possible. Usually doing this reduces your points because of a slight increase in weight, so it can actually also help free up other potential upgrade opportunities if you're running low on points. Front and rear rim size should help with grip, but in reality I've never really seen much of an effect when it comes to racing at the Goliath, which is the thing I probably do the most these days. Usually adds a few kilograms and no points, so it's not a huge problem if you prefer to do it though. Rim style is useful because here you can usually save 6 kilograms or thereabouts depending on the car. Pro tip, just scroll left on the sport and specialized alloy options and wait until you see green. Simply rinse and repeat until you find a style that reduces the weight and you like the look of. Bear in mind that some reduce weight more than others, so be sure to check the maximum saving you can have, if any. Now it's time to add some muscle. In engine, I usually prioritize the biggest horsepower gain versus the biggest weight reduction and least points to cost. One of my first things to check out is camshaft. Then I try pistons and compression, twin turbo, or whatever you can have on this particular car. Supercharger could be great too, particularly at lower classes. Fuel system and ignition also increase power for relatively few points and no real weight gain, if any, while flywheel reduces weight at no real cost, so it's worth doing that too. Avoid intercooler and anything else that really adds weight, as it's usually better to keep weight down than try to compensate with sheer power and brute force. But if you simply want a high top speed, then this route is worth considering. Brakes are another essential in real life, as braking later can make up serious amounts of time on a lap and superior braking systems can prevent fade, which is where your brakes start being a bit rubbish, and that's quite scary at 200 miles an hour. In Forza Horizon 4, it seems to be there's not a lot of difference. Usually I upgrade to a race system if I can, as it can save a bit of weight and it does increase braking power, but actually it's really okay not to. Drivetrain is mostly about adding customization to your car. Race parts allow you to customize your gears and differential settings, both of which do affect how your car handles. So if you have the points, I would say go for it. If you have to ditch one option, I would say the gear upgrade, as the final drive ratio usually does the trick. More on that later. Another grey area is AERO. In theory, it should help you go around corners at the expense of your top speed. Most Forza Horizon 4 cars do seem to favour having it, but you should try it out to see if you can feel a difference, as particularly the front upgrade costs a lot of points. If you think it does help, remember that too much downforce at the rear can reduce your ability to turn. Too much overall can slow you down and also reduce cornering ability. Too little at the front, and you will reduce your potential cornering grip, but more on this stuff later. What about engine swaps, you ask? I favour the V10 if it's available, as it's a good balance of power output and weight, but you can go for the racing V12, as that's also incredibly fast, and the linear power delivery from low revs really makes it versatile in road racing. And once you've done the parts, I would suggest really going over your setup with a fine-tooth comb just to see if there's anything else you can do. You might want to consider ditching some of the less important upgrades above to add something more vitally important. In certain situations where you are just out of reach of a serious power hike or a bit of weight reduction, for instance, you can actually try adding the heavier alloys back to decrease your points rating. So now you have a car and it's kitted up with upgrades and looking shiny and cool. Now for the way I tune my cars. Now I will say that the descriptions in Forza Horizon 4 for each tuning section of the menu are interesting, I will say, but can be ignored quite a lot of the time. And that makes sense, to be fair, because this game is meant to be more arcadey than Forza Motorsport. Tyre pressure is one of the less realistic options. Set the pressure too low in real life and you would expect to see tyres overheating and affecting top speed, among other bad things. If you've ever driven with a very low tyre pressure, you'll know it's really not fun. But the optimal setting is usually somewhere between 14 and 26 psi in this game, which is 1 to about 1.8 bar. What I will say is that the lower you go, the more likely your tyre is to overheat and grip will be lost. So basically there is more importance on driving smoothly and gentle inputs the lower you go. Now you can make this easier by adjusting the sensitivity of your steering in the control settings menu. For higher speed circuits such as Goliath, gentler inputs at the extremes of steering can be helpful to avoid losing control at very high speeds, as can using normal steering instead of simulation. For lower speed circuits, you may want to make it more sensitive. If there's one thing that can really grind your gears in Forza Horizon 4, it's tuning the gears. Get them wrong and you'll end up being slower, which means losing races and making less money and people laughing at you. Well, no, maybe not that one. In Forza Horizon 4, the default gear setting for each car is usually acceptable, but not always. Even if it is, the moment you boost the horsepower, you'll need to then adjust it. The optimal way to do this is to remember that combustion engine cars have a peak horsepower and torque output. This is the point where the engine is at its most powerful and effective, and also usually the noisiest, which is why we love it. What you want to do is change the gears at peak revs, because as the new gear kicks in, your revs are then going to be closest to the peak engine output again, minimizing the time between each change. In Forza Horizon 4 tuning, it is possible to see where peak torque and horsepower kicks in by looking at your car under the engine upgrades, I think. Once you have this figure, you can then go into the gear tuning menu. Here you only get a crude estimate of the revs thanks to the hard to read graph, but it will give you a rough idea of where your changes should be. Ideally, in road racing, acceleration is your priority, but not so much that it kills your top speed and you keep bouncing into the limiter. If your car barely reaches 230 miles per hour during your typical races, why bother giving up so much acceleration? In all honesty, I usually keep the default gearing and slide to the top final ratio slider either left or right until you can see the last gear changing line. That is step one. For step 2, you can then look at your top speed and acceleration figures and jot them down, or if you have a good memory then you don't need to. Now bring the slider back towards acceleration, which is left. You can usually retain the same or better acceleration without sacrificing top speed at all, or only a little. Now you may see some gears crossing over on the gearing graph. This is because you have your unit of measurement set to something other than horsepower. I've seen this can be a problem for some people, so worth bearing in mind. Some Forza Horizon 4 cars with huge amounts of horsepower and torque can actually get away with ignoring first gear when you launch, which reduces the issue of wheel spin, and this can be particularly good for rear-wheel drive and if you have traction control disabled. You can also choose to have fewer gears, reducing the need to shift gears as much and therefore save time. I did this on the Mosler MT900S for my Goliath runs, or at least some of them, and it actually worked very nicely, as you still go very fast but you spend less time changing and worrying about what gear you're in. Really though, it depends on the car and the situation, and usually you need a huge amount of horsepower, so a lot of cars are not going to be able to do this. Speaking of which, gear tuning is largely situational. The instructions before will give you a versatile solution that should work for every type of normal racing. But what about on the drag strip? Well, here you're only going to go a short distance, so sheer acceleration outweighs your top speed even more. In this instance, you want to focus on maximizing acceleration to ensure you cover ground fast, but avoid topping out before you cross the checkered flag and keep wheel spin at bay. Honestly, it's trial and error because each car will have different engine outputs and characteristics, and of course your upgrades will vary. The simple way to perfect your gears here is to run the drag strip over and over and over until you reach your fastest time, or if you're feeling lazy, you could actually Google to see if someone has created the perfect ratio. In theory, you could test your gears with automatic on so that you have one consistent factor, because obviously if you change earlier or later with a different setup, you're going to affect the results. As I said in my Forza tuning tips video, you can also cheat a bit when it comes to copying gearing ratios. Simply download and install a setup from a player you trust, or one that's popular, or both, and then write down at what speed each gear reaches its top speed. With this information, you can then move each individual gear until you have the same shift pattern. It's a bit cheeky, but it works. This is one of the more complicated tuning options to get your head around, so I'd suggest reading the description to the right for the real-world principles. For camber, this is about making sure as much of the tyre surface touches while cornering. Negative camber in conjunction with suspension compression will affect this. To see the stuff in action, you can use the live telemetry overlay and go around a corner with full steering and at pace. If your tyres are around 0 degrees at this point in the corner, you are okay, because that means you have the maximum amount of tyre touching the road when you need it the most. You can access the overlay by assigning it to a button in the controller settings, and then there's a switch to change from ANA to telemetry in the options. Once you find that, you can then just press down as you're driving along, and there are various options you can go through using left and right. If your car has good levels of turn-in and downforce, you can set the front to around -1 of negative camber, give or take a bit. Go more negative if your car is struggling to turn into a corner, aka understeer. Also check your downforce settings if applicable, as that could be part of the problem. For the rear, I usually make this an even lower value as it's less necessary, although you will still want as much of the tyre to touch the ground in a corner. Around 1.7 to 1 usually does the trick. Front toe is usually left alone until you have done all other stuff, as it's a good way to make little handling characteristic adjustments without affecting too many other things. Basically, increasing toe-in at the front helps improve turn-in. Leaving both at 0 can be perfectly acceptable though. Caster is usually best served as a higher number when it comes to Forza Horizon 4 tuning. This will help with turn-in and not really at the expense of straight line stability. Somewhere between 5.5 and 7 tends to work best in my opinion. Higher can be better, but remember that lower can help reduce twitchiness. This is the setting for mid-corner stuff, the bit after turn-in. Basically, the theory is that you can control oversteer and understeer by increasing or decreasing front and rear anti-roll bar stiffness. In Forza Horizon 4, tuning physics seem to be irrelevant. For an all-wheel drive car, you could just whack the front stiffness value to 1 and the rear value to 65. If oversteer is happening, as in the moment when your rear tyres start to want to overtake the front ones, decrease the number on the rear and increase the front. For front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive, you're going to have to do a bit of trial and error and probably make these values more balanced. Here you can control how hard or soft your springs are. Soft helps soak up bumps, but also can reduce cornering grip. Firmness, meanwhile, helps with grip, but can also make it easier to lose grip suddenly. Softer does seem to be best in this game, which makes sense as Forza Horizon 4 races take place on actual roads and not typically smooth circuits. Alternatively, if you have a car that's oversteering out of a corner or is always trying to gain traction, it's best to stiffen up the front springs while softening the rear. Sometimes I use Hokey Hoshi's tuning formula here, as that factors in front and rear weight balance, but to be honest, it doesn't make massive amounts of difference. Ride height in theory is best served as low as possible on a circuit because the lower center of gravity and improved downforce benefits, also an increase in top speed. If however you see or hear your car bottom out, something that can happen, particularly during the Goliath road race as it's so fast and the extreme g-forces going on, up the value until that is sorted. Putting it up 4 notches is usually sufficient. Another one that's somewhat complicated, so have a read of the description first. Lowering the bump stiffness at the front usually helps turning grip, but can also reduce mid-corner oversteer. The rear setting can do a similar job, so I would suggest using a similar or slightly stiffer number and see how you like the feel of the car. Rebound stiffness is similar in principle, but set it to a much higher stiffness value compared to bump stiffness. Go softer and you will see more oversteer at turn in, but then less so for the rest of the turn. If your car turns in like a champion already, then you can go stiffer to help mid and exit speed. The opposite applies for rear rebound stiffness. As before, give this a drive and then see if adjusting the balance between the 2 settings gives you a car more attuned to how you like to drive. Sadly, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. AERO, short for aerodynamics, can be vitally important in racing. In fact, in Formula 1, it's limited to stop drivers from blacking out, such as the level of cornering potential. In Forza Horizon 4, you really only need to know that increasing the front downforce increases oversteer, while increasing rear downforce increases understeer. Increasing either or both reduces acceleration and top speed, as it's effectively pushing your car downward at all times. A usually good way to start aero tuning is to go the most you can at the front and the least at the rear. The sheer difference between the two helps maintain car rotation and cornering grip without really affecting your top speed at all. If your car is already good in this area, you can reduce the front amount to reintroduce acceleration and top speed improvements. Time for the penultimate tab of the tuning menu. This option is only available if you upgraded to race brakes. If not, it will be unchangeable. As far as I can tell, this isn't another moment of Forza Horizon 4's physics playing loose with reality. If you move the slider towards the rear, you would think this makes the rear brakes do more work than the front. However, favouring more rear bias actually increases front braking pressure. I typically favour a few points of extra front braking pressure, somewhere between 45 and 48, but it really depends on your tastes. Brake pressure is how much pressure is exerted when you push the brake. Some people roll with 200%, so you get the most amount of braking power for the least effort, which is faster. But you may struggle to avoid locking the wheels up, particularly if you have ABS off. So consider a little less until you feel more confident. Probably the most complicated to get your head around and also the most noticeable. If you change, differential settings can make or break a setup. This is basically the system that governs the difference in speed between the left and right wheels and can be visualized using a duck. Yep, not even kidding. The theory is that if you set the front to 100%, you would experience understeer as the inside tyre will rotate at the same speed as the outside one. That's the equivalent of the duck paddling both feet with the same amount of power. It goes straight. If you reduce the percent to 0 at the front, this would be akin to the duck only paddling with one leg. And what would happen then? Of course, the duck would swim in a circle. Basically, a faster spinning outside wheel and the slower spinning inside wheel helps the car do a circle and therefore is better in a corner. But this is Forza Horizon 4 tuning we're talking about, so throw that stuff out the window, because increasing the front percent to 100 or just below actually seems to reduce understeer. For coasting through corners, front-rear deceleration should be set as low as possible, as it helps the car grip when you lift off the accelerator. It's the one-legged duck thing all over again. For the rear, if the car is all-wheel drive, you can get away with matching the exact same setting. 100% at the front, 0% at the rear, or whatever adjustments you have made since. This will be different for front and rear wheel drive cars, so you'll have to play around with these settings on a road you're familiar with and see how the car feels when you accelerate in a corner and when you take your foot off the gas. When it comes to balance, my Goliath setups tend to be somewhere between 65 and 70 in this area, as that helps the car feel more like a rear wheel drive one, and so you get some of the positive characteristics without too many of the negative ones. If your current races favour less top speed and superior handling, then this number can be 75 to 85. For even greater handling, you can go higher than 85, but it may start to make the car more of a handful. At 100%, you have turned an all-wheel drive car into a rear-wheel drive one, and therefore you are starting to hinder the benefits from adding that AWD system. Now, of course, one of the biggest questions is how do you pick the car? Well, there are a few ways, including looking at forums, watching some of my videos, or just having a good old Google. If you want to know what sort of car is good for each class, then feel free to look in the description, as I'm going to add in some X, S2, S1A and B class examples. All these cars are best in class and potentially the best in the class and the most overpowered at some point. So they're a good place to start. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, then please let me know in the comments. Take care, bye.